Hi, it's Halloween again, and I freaking love Halloween. I love everything about it. It's my holiday. Screw Christmas. Not interested. Halloween's my time of year. So this year, we went into Edinburgh, and we went to the Edinburgh Dungeons, which I've now been to 4 times now. It's every time we go back, it's different. Like, something has changed, a ride has been added or taken away. It is more of an indoor theme park to a certain extent. There's a lot of play acting.
Good luck, peasants. I'll see you at the end of the tour. If you survive.
Everyone's dressed up as some kind of character, and you can get right in about. It's all very interactive, but it's really just for the entertainment of the thing. There's not a great deal of information that you get from the dungeons. Makes for a great day out. But when we went in and we're going around, for example, you had a torturer, and she's asking, what do you think this was used for?
No, does anyone know what this is? Shout out if you think. Yes.
Pincers.
What, sorry?
Pincers. Heat them up, grab what you like, pull it off. Tongues, nipples, noses.
You a torturer, my goodness. Yes, this is a tongue tear.
She's getting people up and going, oh, this is how this would be used on you, and blah 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 for this crime. But there was only maybe 3 or 4 implements that were addressed, and the most horrific in my mind were the boots, and supposed witches were tortured with the boots. It was like a big iron shoe that your feet went into. It had slits to either side, and wooden wedges would literally be beaten into these slits, into the sides of these metal, and it would just crush your feet and legs to nothing. And it wasn't addressed. There was a few items in the room that you could spy in the darkness, but we didn't find out anything about the items. Again, it's more for show than information. But the one part that always interests me, and it's undergone a few changes over the years. So last time I went, it had a boat ride in the dark associated with it, but they were telling us that during the pandemic that had stopped, and they're looking to reopen it. But it's Sawney Bean's escapades that they're talking about at this time, and his family are all getting in about and coming out with wee quips, and so there wasn't the boat ride, but they addressed Sawney Bean. Sawney Bean is not a character that comes up very often at all in Scottish history. Certainly not the books that I've encountered so far. There may yet be one out there that really lays out his whole history. He does make it into J.H. Burton's Narratives from Criminal Trials in Scotland, which was published in 1852, and he's only noted as a footnote. It's footnote 13 of a chapter about the getting of the Clan Gregor, the proceedings against the Clan Gregor. And this footnote reads, among Captain Johnson's Scottish ruffians, there is a certain Sawney Bean, an anthropophagist, the patriarch of an extensive clan or progeny, for they were all descended from himself, who lived in a vast cavern and fed on human flesh. The memoir is accompanied with an appropriate plate representing Sawney at the mouth of his cavern, looking abroad for victims, while a female descendant conveys 2 human legs within the cavern to be put in pickle. The gang, it appears, were not discovered until the extent of their appetites produced a sensible effect on the national census. And you would think, if there is a whole family, an extensive clan or progeny, who are munching on humans just to survive, there's going to have been humans missing, and someone to have missed them. So you would think that there would have been even some kind of basic early attempt at investigation to root out these miscreants, these anthropophagists, these cannibals, you know. Robert Chambers, in his Book of Days, published in 1886, does have a chapter for the 27th of May entitled British Anthropophagi. Now, I had already learned of Sawney Bean, probably through previous visits to the Edinburgh Dungeons, and I was surprised that Sawney Bean and his family were not mentioned. What is mentioned here is St. Jerome, who visited Gaul in his youth about the year 380, has the following passage in one of his works. He learned that the Atticoti, the people of the country now called Scotland, when hunting in the woods, preferred the shepherd to his flocks, and chose only the most fleshy and delicate parts for eating. This reminds us extremely of the late reports brought home by Monsieur de Chaillot regarding the people of the gorilla country in Western Africa. Gibbon, in adverting to it, makes it the occasion of a compliment to Scotland. If, says he, in the neighbourhood of the commercial and literary town of Glasgow, a race of cannibals has already existed, we may contemplate, in the period of the Scottish history, the opposite extremes of savage and civilised life. Such reflections tend to enlarge the circle of our ideas and to encourage the pleasing hope that New Zealand may produce in a future age the Hume of the Southern Hemisphere. There is reason to fear that cannibalism was not quite extinct in Scotland, even in ages which may be deemed comparatively civilised. Andrew Winton has a grisly passage in his rhyming chronicle regarding a man who lived so brief a while before his own day that he might easily have heard of him from surviving contemporaries. It was about the year 1339, when a large part of Scotland, even the best and most fertile, had been desolated by the armies of Edward III. About Perth there was a country sae waste that wonder was to see, for until well great space thereby was neither house left nor herbery. Of deer there was then sic foison abundance, that they would ne'er come to the town, sae great default was near that stead, than mony were in hunger dead. A carle, they said, was near thereby, that would set settis or traps, commonly, children and women for to slay, and swains that he might overta, and ate them all that he get might. Christen cleek till name be hight, that sorry life continued he, while waste but folk was the country. Lindsay of Pitscotty has a still more dismal story regarding the close of the reign of James II about 1460, a time also within the recollection of people living in the epoch of the historian. He says, about this time there was an brigand ta'en with his hale family, who haunted a place in Angus. This mischievous man had in execrable fashion to take all young men and children he could steal away quietly, or take away without knowledge, and eat them, and the younger they were, esteemed them the mere tender and delicious. For the whilk cause and damnable abuse, he with his wife and bairns were all burnt, except ane young wench of a year old, wha was saved and brought to Dundee, where she was brought up and fostered. And when she came to a woman's years, she was condemned and burnt quick for that crime. It is said that when she was coming to the place of execution, there gathered an huge multitude of people, and specially of women, cursing her that she was so unhappy to commit so damnable deeds, to whom she turned about with an ireful countenance, saying, "Wherefore chide ye wi' me, as if I had committed an unworthy act? Give me credence, and trow me, if ye had an experience of eating men and women's flesh, ye will think it so delicious that ye will never forbear it again." So, but, or without, any sign of repentance, this unhappy traitor died in the sight of the people. Now, you would think that even if the story of Sawney Bean and his family were fictional, Robert Chambers probably would have still found it an interesting enough story to have included here in his rundown of British anthropophagi. I'm not sure of his reasons for not including it. I've not found anything to suggest that Sawney Bean and his family were set fact, but I'm not averse to the idea of that. So after the dungeons, we went to a tour. It was a true crime tour of Mary King's Close, which is just off the Royal Mile opposite St Giles's Church in Edinburgh. We were given a lot of information, far more than we gleaned from the dungeons, and I'm afraid I wasn't allowed to take photos or video footage either in the dungeons or in Mary King's Close. It was all forbidden, so I have taken notes of what was discussed, and I thought we would go into the information today. So Mary King's Close was one of a number of streets that were levelled, not quite to the ground. So these buildings were about 12 stories high that lined these closes, and in an attempt to renew the city, give it a bit of a lease of life, some money was granted to the city, and the Royal Exchange was built on top of these closes. So the top majority of the buildings were just taken off, and then the rest was filled in with rubble, etc., and just built over. So Mary King's Close is underneath what's now the Edinburgh City Chambers, and you can still get in about it. Obviously, we did the tour. It's quite deep down, you know, it's all very steep. It's amazing to go and see. It's a bit like going on a Central Station tour in Glasgow, because Central Station was literally just planted on top of a bunch of streets that still exist under it. Most of the information that I knew already prior to this tour was from the wonderful James Grant's Old and New Edinburgh, which was published in 1880. It's a 3-volume set, 2 volumes of which are already uploaded to Random Scottish History. And this is a man who equates very much along the lines of Charles Waddy in my mind as being a Scottish historian who's just so good. He just has this knack of just condensing information to make it really succinct, easy to get your head around. He can tell you a lot in the space of a paragraph, really. So a lot of the information that I'm going to share with you as we go through the facts that were given to us on the tour are from James Grant's Old and New Edinburgh, because he has all the information, of course. So we have from chapter 20 of volume 1 regarding the Royal Exchange itself. In 1753, we discover the first symptoms of vitality in Edinburgh after the Union, when the pitiful sum of £1,500 was subscribed by the Convention of Royal Boroughs for the purpose of beautifying the city, and the projected Royal Exchange was fairly taken in hand. If wealth had not increased much, the population had, and by the middle of the 18th century the citizens had begun to find the inconvenience they laboured under by being confined within the old Flodden Wall. Many ancient alleys and closes, one of which was Mary King's, whose names are well nigh forgotten now, were demolished on the north side of the High Street to procure a site for the new Royal Exchange. Some of these had already become ruinous and must have been of vast antiquity. Many beautifully sculptured stones belonging to houses that were built into the Curious Tower, erected by Mr. Walter Ross at the Dean, and are now in a similar tower at Portobello. Others were scattered about the garden grounds at the foot of the Castle Rock, and still show the important character of some of the edifices demolished. Among them was a lintel discovered when clearing out the bed of the North Loch, with the initials I.S. and the date 1658, supposed to be those of James, the 10th Lord Somerville, who after serving long in the Venetian army died at a great age in 1677. On the 13th of September 1753, the first stone of the new exchange was laid by George Drummond. From chapter 26 we're told about Mary King's Close in particular. Mary King's Close was long a place of terror to the superstitious, as one of the last retreats of the desolating plague of 1645. Who Mary King was is now unknown, but though the alley is roofless and ruined, says one, writing of it in 1845, with weeds, wallflowers, grass, and even little trees, flourishing luxuriantly among the falling walls, her name may still be seen painted on the street corner. For some generations after the plague, in which most of its inhabitants perished, its houses remained closed, and gradually it became a place of mystery and horror, the abode of 1,000 spectres and nameless terrors, for superstition peopled it with inhabitants whom all feared and none cared to succeed. Those who had been foolhardy enough to peep through the windows after nightfall saw the spectres of the long-departed denizens engaged in their wonted occupations. Headless forms danced through the moonlit apartments. On one occasion a godly minister and 2 pious elders were scared out of their senses by the terrible vision of a raw head and blood-dripping arm, which protruded from the wall in this terrible street, and flourished a sword over their heads, and many other terrors which are duly chronicled in Satan's Invisible World. Yet it was down this place that the wild young master of Grey dragged the fair Mistress Carnegie, whom, sword in hand, he had abducted from her father's house at the head of 12 men-at-arms, and took her by boat across the loch that rippled at the foot of the slope. That's your Norloch. In Drummond of Hawthornden's poems, published by the Maitland Club, there is an epigram on Mary King's Pest. Turn, citizens, to God, repent, repent, and pray your bedlam frenzies may relent. Think not rebellion a trifling thing, this plague doth fight for Marie and the King. An old gentleman, says Wilson, has often described to us his visits to Mary King's Close, along with his companions when a schoolboy. The most courageous of them would approach these dread abodes of mystery, and after shouting through the keyhole or broken window shutter, they would run off with palpitating hearts, the popular superstition being that if these long deserted abodes were opened, the deadly pest imprisoned there would once more burst forth and desolate the land. Mr. George Sinclair, Professor of Moral Philosophy in the University of Glasgow and afterwards Minister of Eastwood in Renfrewshire, by the publication in 1685 of his work Satan's Invisible World Discovered, which I'm absolutely going to have to get a copy of, did much to add to the terrors of Mary King's Close by his account of apparitions seen therein, and recorded by witnesses of undoubted veracity, a work long hawked about the streets by the itinerant sellers of gingerbread. The last or northern portion of the close, with its massive vaulted lower stories, was an open ruin in 1845. The south or upper had fallen into ruin after a fire in 1750, and was in that condition when a portion of the site was required for the west side of the Royal Exchange 3 years after. This chapter continues about Mary King's Close, and it would seem that it really did get under the skin of the superstitious. It would appear from the professor's narrative that Mr. Thomas Coulthart, a respectable law agent whose legal business had begun to flourish, took a better style of house in Mary King's Close. Their maidservant was, of course, duly warned by obliging neighbours that the house was haunted, and in terror she gave up her situation and fled, leaving Mr. and Mrs. Coulthart to face whatever they might see alone. Accordingly, it came to pass that when the lady had seated herself by the bedside of her goodman, who, being slightly indisposed on the Sunday afternoon, had lain down to rest, while she read the Scriptures, chancing to look up, she saw, to her intense dismay, a human head, apparently that of an old man with a grey floating beard, suspended in mid-air at a little distance, and gazing intently at her with elvish eyes. She swooned at this terrible sight and remained insensible till the neighbours returned from church. Her husband strove to reason her out of her credulity, and the evening passed without further trouble. But they had not been long in bed when he himself espied the same phantom head by the firelight, floating in mid-air and eyeing him with ghostly eyes. He lighted a candle and betook him to prayer, but with little effect, for in about an hour the bodiless phantom was joined by that of a child, also suspended in mid-air, and this was followed by an arm, naked from the elbow, which, in defiance of all Coulthart's prayers and pious interjections, seemed bent on shaking hands with him and his wife. In the most solemn way, the luckless lawyer conjured these phantoms to entrust him with the story of any wrongs they wished righted, but all to no purpose. The old tenants evidently regarded the new as intruders, and others came to their aid, for the naked arm was joined by a spectral dog, which curled itself up in a chair and went to sleep. And then came a cat, and many other creatures, but of grotesque and monstrous forms, till the whole room swarmed with them, so that the honest couple were compelled to kneel on their bed, there being no standing room on the floor, till suddenly, with a deep and awful groan as of a strong man dying in agony, the whole vanished, and Mr. and Mrs. Coltheart found themselves alone. In those days of superstition, Mr. Coltheart, if we are to believe Professor Sinclair, must have been a man of more than ordinary courage, for he continued to reside in this terrible house till the day of his death, without further molestation, but when that day came, it would seem not to have been unaccompanied by the supernatural. At the moment he expired, a gentleman whose friend and law agent he was, while asleep in his bed beside his wife at Trinent, 10 miles distant, was roused by the nurse, who had been terrified by something like a cloud moving about the room. Starting up with the first instinct of a Scot in those days, he seized his sword to defend himself, when the something gradually assumed the form and face of a man, who looked at him pale and ghastly, and in whom he recognised his friend, Thomas Coltheart. Mary King's Close itself, as your average city centre street back in the day, used to go from the Royal Mile down to the Norloch. The Norloch was a stagnant pool of water that I think the city council were pretty set on eradicating at some point. They did that eventually. And all the effluent from Edinburgh, when people would chuck out their windows, would just flow down the street. Gravity would take it down into the Norloch, you know. The Flodden Wall encircled 3 sides of Edinburgh, with the 4th being the Norloch. Now, Mary King herself had a stall, and that was at the top of the close. So she was the first face you'd see on approaching the close from the Royal Mile. The buildings, like I said, were all 12 stories in height, and there were doors to each apartment facing out into the street. Now, to access those, it was a turnpike that you would go up, which was basically just a wooden pole with wooden slats making a spiral staircase. There weren't railings or anything, and in that way you could access each of the doors of the closes. There wasn't an indoor close as we would know it now. The richest would station themselves in the apartments at the top, with the poorest being on the ground floors. So they all kind of cohabited, the rich and poor. It wasn't certain sections of the city. It was buildings that were divided into your rich, your middle class, and your poor. In 1749, there was something called the Nastiness Act, which was against the disposal of human waste into the streets between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. The name of this act was the Act of Council regulating the time for emptying and laying down ashes, foul water, and other nastiness, and was dated the 12th of July 1749. Now, like I say, all of this sewage was going into the Norloch, which was bogging, probably smelled real bad, and the test for witches to prove themselves as either witches or not was to be chucked into the Norloch to see if they drowned or floated or swam. Obviously, if you floated or survived by swimming, you were a witch, you know. You had to drown in the human slurry that you'd been chucked into to prove yourself not to be a witch in Edinburgh, apparently. So it wasn't just witches that were chucked in this stagnant water. It was apparently also just people of loose morals or loose living. So we're told in chapter 12, again from Grant's Old and New Edinburgh of 1880, the garden wherein St. David budded trees and cultivated such fruits and flowers as were then known in Britain is a place of flowers and shrubs again, save where it is intersected by the prosaic railway or the transverse earthen mound. But those who see the valley now may find it difficult to realise that for 300 years it was an impassable lake, formed for the defence of the city on the north, when the wall of 1450 was built, but the well that fed it is flowing still, as when David referred to it in his Holyrood Charter. Fed by it and other springs, the loch was retained by a dam and sluice at the foot of Hawkerston's Wynd, the dam being a passable footway from the city to the northern fields. In 1538, prior to committing the effigy of St Giles to the flames, the reformers ducked it in the loch, it being the legal place for sousing all offenders against the 7th commandment, which is adultery. In 1562, the town council enacted that all persons of loose life should be ducked in a certain part of the loch, wherein a pillar and basin were formed for the purpose. But this not having the desired effect, all such persons were ordered to be committed, without distinction, to the iron room of the Tolbooth, to be kept therein for a month on bread and water, and to be then whipped out of the city at a cart's tail. The deacon of the Fleshers having fallen under this law, the Crafts, deeming it an indignity to their order, assembled in arms, broke open the prison, and released him. So, I think that would have worked on me. I think if I had been leading whatever constitutes a loose life, and I had been ducked in sewage as punishment, I might strive to no longer lead the loose life, because I don't know that I would want that again. That's pretty awful, that's pretty disgusting. And I just feel sorry for the witches that were literally made to drown in the thing, like, bogging. We're also told that there were people that chose to make their own way into the Norloch. We're told it was also the frequent scene of suicide, and on this point 1 or 2 droll anecdotes are related. A man was proceeding deliberately to drown himself when a crowd of the townspeople rushed down to the waterside, venting cries of horror and alarm at the spectacle, yet without actually venturing into the water to prevent him from accomplishing the rash act. Hearing the tumult, the father of the late Lord Henderland threw up his window in James's Court, and leaning out cried down the brae to the people, "What's all the noise about? Can't ye e'en let the man gang to the deil his ain gate?" Whereupon the honest man quietly walked out of the loch, to the no small amusement of the lately appalled neighbours. There was a lady was saved from suicide by her hoop petticoat. So there we go. Also states here that the loch must have abounded in some kind of fish, as the council register refers to an eel ark set therein at 10 merks yearly for the benefit of the Trinity Hospital, and in February 1655 Nicholl records that in consequence of the excessively stormy weather, some thousands of dead eels were cast upon its banks, to the admiration of many. Now, I do know that there was something that was dubbed Norloch trout. Norloch trout was like a mutton, really, and I think it was called Norloch trout because it was probably the lowest of low meat that you could part with your last halfpenny for. Now, we know that Mary King's Close is right opposite St Giles's Church, but this whole area was the Market Cross of Edinburgh. Now, the Market Cross was a battlemented octagonal tower furnished with 4 angular turrets. It was 16 feet in diameter, 15 feet high. From this rose the centre pillar, also octagon, 20 feet in height, surmounted by a beautiful Gothic capital, terminated by a crowned unicorn. Now, the Market Cross was got rid of in 1756. It does say that from the side of that venerable shaft, royal proclamations, solemn denunciations of excommunication and outlawry involving ruin and death went forth for ages, and strange and terrible have been the scenes, the cruelties, the executions and absurdities it has witnessed. We're going to get into some of that. This information is from chapter 16 of, once again, Grant's Old and New Edinburgh. He really covers his bases where Edinburgh's concerned. The man did excellent work. Now we're told that under the shadow of that cross have been transacted many deeds of real horror, more than we can enumerate here, but a few may suffice. There in 1563 Sir James Tarbot, a Roman Catholic priest, was pilloried in his vestments with a chalice bound to his hands, and, as Knox has it, was served by the mob with his Easter eggs, till he was pelted to death. There died Sir William Kirkcaldy, hanged with his face to the sun, as Knox curiously predicted before his own death, for the execution took place at 4 in the afternoon, when the sun was in the west, and there, in time to come, died his enemy Morton. There died Montrose and many of his cavalier comrades, amid every ignominy that could be inflicted upon them, and the two Argyles, father and son. An incredible number of real and imaginary criminals have rendered up their lives on that fatal spot, and among not the least interesting of the former we may mention Gilderoy, or the red-haired lad, whose real name was Patrick MacGregor, and who, with 10 other Caterans accused of cattle lifting, and many wild pranks on the shores of Loch Lomond, when brought to Edinburgh, were drawn backwards on a hurdle to the cross, on the 27th of July, 1636, and there hanged. Gilderoy and John Forbes suffering on a higher gallows than the rest, and further, having their heads and hands struck off to be affixed to the city gates. Here, culprits underwent scourging, branding, ear-nailing, and nose-pinching, with tongue-boring and other punishments deemed minor. As a specimen of these exhibitions we shall take the following from the diary of Nichol verbatim. Last September, 1652, 2 Englishes, for drinking the king's health, were taken and bunned at Edinburgh Cross, where either of them received 39 whips on their naked backs and shoulders. Thereafter their lugs were nailed to the gallows. The one had his lug cut it from the root with a razor, the other being also nailed to the gibbet, had his mouth scobbit, and his tongue being drawn out the full length, was bound together betwixt 2 sticks, hard together, with a scansy thread for the space of half 1 hour thereby. Punishments of this cruel kind were characteristic of the times, and were not peculiar to the Scottish capital alone. So next we are told about James the 6th of Scotland and 1st of England. He authored a number of works, the 2 main ones being the Bible, because he knew what God meant to say, and demonology. And demonology was really devoted to everything supernatural, witchcraft, etc., the rooting out of them. Now, we're told in the Kelso Chronicle, this is in an article entitled Random Notes Anent the Antiquities, Traditions, Superstitions and Old Manners and Customs of the Borders. This one's devoted to witchcraft in particular, and we're told about James VI's propensity for finding witches. Now, it was because he had gone over to Denmark to collect his wife, Anne. On their way back, apparently his ship alone was separated from the rest of the fleet and subjected to a real bad storm that almost drowned everybody, almost lost the boat. They made it back okay, and the idea was put about that it was a convention of North Berwick witches that had created this in order to do away with James VI. So his whole mind from then on was sort of like, I have to get these people that are out to get me, you know, however's best to do that. So he actually went and wrote something of a manual, which certainly had whispers of the witchcraft trials that were going in Europe prior to this. I mean, we'd had witchcraft trials in Scotland already, but he really wanted to solidify that this was a threat to not only him, but the country and the people. So we're told here in the Kelso Chronicle, the trying of witches was reduced to a system and had its laws and regulations for the more effectual discovery of such as had sold themselves to the evil one. One was finding private marks on their bodies, which King James in his demonology calls finding of their mark and trying the insensibleness thereof. So the witch prickers would prick different bits of your body. They would tend to go for scars, moles, any kind of blemish, and they would prick you. And if you didn't feel it or you didn't bleed, oh, you were a witch, you know. Now, another was weighing the suspected person against the church Bible. An elderly woman was accused of bewitching her neighbour's spinning wheel. She was conducted to the church, stripped of all her clothes, and weighed against the Bible, when to the no small mortification of her accuser, she outweighed it and was honourably acquitted of the charge. A third method was forcing the accused to weep, for the modern Solomon, in the work above mentioned, the Demonology, says that witches cannot even shed tears, though women in general are like the crocodile, ready to weep on every light occasion. But the most popular and effectual mode of trying a witch was swimming her in water. She was stripped naked and cross-bound, the right thumb to the left toe, and the left thumb to the right toe. In this state she was cast into a pond or river, in Edinburgh it was going to be your Norloch, in which, if guilty, it was thought impossible for her to sink. This test, King James observes, God hath appointed for a supernatural sign of the monstrous impiety of witches, that the water shall refuse to receive them in her bosom that have shaken off them the sacred water of baptism, and wilfully refused the benefit thereof. The following example of the confession of a witch and of the horrible tortures which were endured will suffice to convey to the reader some adequate idea of the delusions and cruelties of the reign of witchcraft. In the remarkable account of witches of Scotland about 1591, reprinted in the Gentleman's Magazine for 1779 is the following. Agnes Sampson confessed that at the time when His Majesty, King James VI, was in Denmark, she, accompanied by parties before specially named, took a cat and christened it, and afterwards bound to each part of that cat the chiefest parts of a dead man, and several joints of his body, and that in the night following the said cat was conveyed into the midst of the sea by all these witches sailing in their riddles or sieves, as is aforesaid, and so left the said cat right before the town of Leith in Scotland. This done, there did arise such a tempest in the sea as a greater hath not been seen, which tempest was the cause of the perishing of a boat or vessel coming over from the town of Burnt Island to the town of Leith, wherein were sundry jewels and rich gifts, which should have been presented to the now Queen of Scotland at her Majesty's coming to Leith. Again, it is confessed that the said christened cat was the cause that the King's Majesty's ship, at his coming forth of Denmark, had a contrary wind to the rest of his ships, these being in his company, which thing was most strange and true, as his King's Majesty acknowledgeth. The said Agnes Sampson, in the course of her confession, implicated one Dr. Fear, master of the school at Saltpans, and was put to the torture, and confessed that he was registrar to the devil, and sundry times preached at North Barrack Kirk to a number of notorious witches, the very persons who are said to have pretended to bewitch and drown his Majesty in the sea coming from Denmark. He was committed to prison, when he escaped, but was afterwards retaken and brought before his Majesty, when, horrible dictu, the following scene took place. His nails upon all his fingers were riven and pulled off with an instrument called in Scottish a turkis, which in England are called a pavre or pincers, and under every nail there was thrust in 2 needles over, even up to the heads. Then was he with all convenient speed by commandment conveyed again to the torment of the boots, which I've talked about previously, wherein he continued a long time, and did abide so many blows in them that his legs were crushed and beaten together as small as might be, whereby they were made unserviceable for ever. After undergoing these and other tortures, too harrowing to mention, the poor schoolmaster of Saltpans was soon afterwards strangled, and then burned on the Castle Hill of Edinburgh, January 1591. The witchcraft trials were a feckin' travesty. It was just a way for people to get rid of their rivals, their antagonists, neighbours, anybody that they felt had slighted them in any way. Could just accuse them of witchcraft and be done with them, so to speak, and not quickly either. To get them to confess to even half of that, can you imagine what they went through? Like, I mean, this bloody master of a school is admitted to being a registrar of the devil. Are you kidding? Now, when I say that people would accuse people of witchcraft for any reason, it was a fact. Jealousy was a big one. So we were told the story of Euphemia MacLean, who I've discussed in previous witchcraft videos, last year's paranormal randomness from Scottish history, etc. Now, Euphemia was from a really prominent family. She had wealth behind her, to the point where her husband actually took her surname. Now, they lived right next to Mary King's Close, and her in-laws and husband were always trying to get the better of her finances, trying to take them under their control. She wasn't having any of it, you know. So the witchcraft trials were going about, and records do exist of their attempts to obtain her funds by legal means. But these failed because the money was rightfully hers from her family, you know. Now, her brother-in-law, he saw an opportunity to get her as a witch, and in a kind of roundabout way, he accused Gillis Duncan of the crime, who was a servant. She was tortured, and she named Euphemia as a witch. From Chambers' Edinburgh Journal, in an article entitled Sketches of Superstitions, this is Witchcraft in Scotland, we're told here about one of the meetings Agnes Sampson had with King James, because King James would interview witches himself. He was really invested in the witchcraft trials. And she was examined about the meetings and dealings that she had with the North Berwick witches. And she had mentioned that they went with flagons of wine, making merry and drinking by the way in the same riddles or sieves to the Kirk of North Berwick and Lothian, so they're using these sieves as boats, and that after they had landed, took hands on the land and danced this reel or short dance, singing all with one voice. Come or go ye before, come or go ye, if ye will not go before, come or let me. At which she confessed that Gillis Duncan did go before them, playing this reel or dance upon a small trump called a Jew's harp, until they entered into the Kirk of North Berwick. Now, Gillis is already going to have been targeted as a witch by Euphemia McCallion's brother-in-law. So I think she was already in the hands of the authorities, and Agnes Sampson has gone, oh, well, that's an easy tag she's already got, so I'll just name her, you know, because they had to name people in order to stop the tortures. These made the king in a wonderful admiration, and he sent for the said Gillis Duncan, who upon the like trump did play the said dance before the king's majesty, who, in respect of the strangeness of these matters, took great delight to be present at their examinations. We're told that Gillis named Euphemia, and this article goes on to talk about Euphemia herself. It says, these disgraceful proceedings were not without their parallel in other families of note of the day. Euphemia McCallion, daughter of an eminent judge, Lord Clifton Hall, was burned at the stake in 1591, having been convicted, if not of witchcraft, at least of a long career of intercourse with pretenders to witchcraft, whom she employed to remove obnoxious persons out of her way, tasks which they accomplished by the very simple means of poisoning, where they did accomplish them at all. The jury found this violent and abandoned woman, for such she certainly was, guilty of participation in the murder of her own godfather, of her husband's nephew, and another individual. They also found her guilty of having been at the wise women of Keith's great witch convention of North Berwick, but every witch of the day was compelled to admit having been there, out of compliment to the king, to whom it was a source of agreeable terror to think himself of so much importance as to call for a solemn convocation of the powers of evil to overthrow him. Euphemia MacCallion was burnt in ashes, quick to the death. This was a doom not assigned to the less guilty. Who do we believe? Do we believe the Chambers article in that this abandoned woman was set on poisoning people? Or are we to believe the records that her in-laws had really been trying to get her wealth, had continuously failed, and it was one of their own that tagged her as a witch, decided to get her in that roundabout way of having Galis Duncan point finger at her? It even states that one of her apparent victims was her husband's nephew. Now, if the in-laws were in on it, they would have no trouble going, yeah, she tried to murder one of her own. Oh my God, get her. You know. And her wealth probably did fall to her husband on her death. The Edinburgh University have an interactive map of witchcraft cases, which I'll post a link in the description. I had a look and it's actually really fat. You could spend a real long time looking at this map. Every time you zoom in, there's more up here, you know. Now, in 2022, the Scottish Government, rather late to the game, apologised for the witch trials, the convictions and the deaths of supposed witches. Better late than never, I guess. Witch prickers existed on behalf of the Kirk. Like I said, they would find a blemish or a mark, and if you didn't feel that, if you didn't bleed from that, some witch prickers that I've heard tell of had retractable needles. So it was almost like a magician's trick with the sword, you know, where they would like prick people and go, you're not bleeding, can you feel that? And they'd be like, no, and their skin wouldn't be broken because the needle literally retracted into the handle. Now, from the Scottish Review, Witchcraft in Scotland, 1861, we have a little bit about John Kincaid, who was a Scottish witch pricker. It tells us, the numbers indeed lead us to expect a return to the barbarities of the time of James VI. This is in Charles II's reign. But this was far from being the case. On the contrary, there are many signs that the council were glad of any excuse for mitigating the cruelty with which suspected witches had formerly been treated. In February 1662, James Welsh was whipped through Edinburgh and put in the House of Correction for a year for falsely accusing several persons. 3 months later, John Kincaid, the pricker or witch finder of Trinent, whose fame in Scotland had at one time emulated that of his English analogue Matthew Hopkins, was imprisoned by the council for presuming to prick and try witches on his own responsibility, and was only released on giving bail for his amendment. And during the same month, a proclamation was issued prohibiting anyone from apprehending persons suspect of witchcraft without authority from the council, the sheriffs of counties, or their deputies, a rule which was thereafter adhered to with tolerable strictness, but that which most clearly shows the humaner intentions of the council is the clause henceforth appearing in their commissions, to the effect that no confessions shall be used to extract confessions, and that the sanity of all confessants shall be inquired into before sentence. That spelled the end, really, of the witchcraft trials. By the start of the 18th century, people weren't as believing, people weren't being picked up for such crimes. Those that were, sparse, very few and far between, and there was no need for the witch prickers. Can you imagine these men who took upon themselves the authority of trying women bodily as witches? What kind of abuse did these women see? Forget the tortures. Before they even got to that point, these men thought they could do anything to these supposed witches. You know, they were less than human. Of course, they sported with the devil. So I can only imagine the horrors these women endured prior to getting before a court, prior to even coming under tortures. On to a little bit about the Greyfriars Kirk. So we were told about potentially the world's first concentration camp, which was formed inside the Greyfriars Kirk. Now, there were about 1,200 Covenanters held over the course of a winter there, with not very many of them seeing the spring. Bloody George Mackenzie, who was a judge, put them there. He advocated, however, on behalf of women during the witch trials, due to his belief that it was a farce. Witchcraft didn't exist. People were stupid to believe that it did, So in that, he was very level-headed. There's a little bit about Bloody George Mackenzie in the Chambers Edinburgh Journal in an article entitled Greyfriars Kirkyard. As it is the proverbial privilege of the grave to level distinctions and reconcile enemies, there is little occasion to wonder that the same burial ground contains the body of Sir George Mackenzie, the legal officer whose duty it was for a considerable time to prosecute those patriots to the death. This eminent and erudite person, however, had also his panegyrists, and the inscription upon his very beautiful mausoleum describes him as an ornament of his age, and a man kind to all, except a rebellious crew from whose violence with tongue and pen he defended his country and king, whose virulence he stayed by the sword of justice, and whose ferocity he by the force of reason blunted, and only did not subdue. Popular feeling, however, has taken a very different turn respecting the tomb of Mackenzie, from what it manifests regarding the lowly graves of the martyrs. The boys, till a late period, entertained the idea that the sprite of this great persecutor remained restless in its superb but gloomy tenement, and used to deem themselves very heroic if, in a still summer evening, they could venture up to the place and cry, immediately after running away, "Bloody Mackingie, come out of your door, lift the sneck and draw the bar." It is curious to reflect that a peculiarity of political and religious feeling should have subjected to such an epithet the most learned and polished man of his time, the friend of Dryden, and the first cultivator of polite English literature in Scotland. Depends what side of the fence you came on. Obviously, if you were a Covenanter, he wasn't going to be your pal, since he was obviously very loyal to his monarch. We were then told about Thomas Aikenhead, who was the last man to be executed on a charge of blasphemy on the island. He was the last in Britain to have been executed for such a crime. So from Chambers' Domestic Annals of 1885, the same Robert Chambers that did the Book of Days and the Edinburgh Journal that we've already quoted from, in his chapter for the reign of William III, talks about Thomas Aikenhead. He tells us, Thomas Aikenhead, a youth of 18, son to the deceased James Aikenhead, chirurgeon, or surgeon, in Edinburgh, was now tried by the High Court of Justiciary for breach of the 21st Act of the First Parliament of Charles II, against the crime of blasphemy, which act had been ratified by the 11th Act of the 5th session of the Parliament of the present reign. It was alleged in the indictment that the young man had, for 12 months past, been accustomed to speak of theology as a rhapsody of feigned and ill-invented nonsense, calling the Old Testament Ezra's Fables, and the New the history of the impostor Christ, further cursing Moses, Ezra, and Jesus, and all men of that sort. Like as, pursued this document, you reject the mystery of the blessed Trinity, and say it is not worth any man's refutation, and you also scoff at the mystery of the incarnation of Jesus Christ. As to the doctrine of redemption by Jesus, you say it is a proud and presumptuous device. You also deny spirits, and you have maintained that God, the world, and nature are but one thing, and that the world was from eternity. You have said that you hope to see Christianity greatly weakened, and that you are confident it will, in a short time, be utterly extirpate. Aikenhead, though impenitent at first, no sooner received this indictment in prison than he endeavoured to stop proceedings by addressing the Lords of Justiciary a petition and retraction, in which he professed the utmost abhorrence of the expressions attributed to him, saying he trembled even to repeat them himself, and further avowing his firm faith in the gospel, in the immortality of the soul, in the doctrine of the Trinity, and in the divine authority of Scripture. The jury, nevertheless, unanimously found it proven that the panel, Thomas Aikenhead, has railed against the first person, and also cursed and railed our blessed Lord, the second person of the Holy Trinity. They further found the other crimes libelled proven, namely the denying the incarnation of our Saviour, the Holy Trinity, and scoffing at the Holy Scriptures. Wherefore the judges discern and adjudge the said Thomas Aikenhead to be taken to the Galilee betwixt Leith and Edinburgh upon Friday the 8th day of January next to come, and there to be hanged on a gibbet till he be dead, and his body to be interred at the foot of the gallows. We were told by our guide that it was one particular statement that was overheard that got Thomas in front of the judge in the first place to be condemned. Apparently he's walking past a church on a cold day, possibly St. Giles's. He stated he'd rather be in hell with the devil than out in the cold. And that's what got him done for blasphemy in 1697, and he was the last to be condemned and executed for that particular crime. In our first rundown of Mary King's Close, it did mention the 1645 plague that really spelled the end for that part of the city. All the houses just remained boarded up thereafter. The people had felt that in opening them they may release the plague again. Now there were two types of plague at the time. You had the pneumonic plague, which affected the lungs, had you coughing up blood, and had only about a 5% survival rate. And you had the bubonic plague, which affected the lymph nodes, and that you got that from bites of fleas, etc. That's what gave you the big buboes at your lymph nodes, your neck, your underarm, your oxter, your groin, etc. And you got these big black boils, And we were told that in getting rid of these, the only real cure at the time, pre-anaesthetic, pre-antibiotics, was to drain it, pierce these boils, these big black boils, let out all the pus and blood and everything, and then get a red hot poker to cauterize the wound that was left. Again, pre-anaesthetic. Now, despite that seeming horrible, the bubonic plague actually had about a 50-50 chance of survival, which was far better than the pneumonic in terms of how severe it was, how bad it got you. Anaesthetic, which would have helped these people get over the red hot poker and the lancing, etc., wasn't discovered until Dr. James Young Simpson discovered chloroform. In chapter 20 of Grant's Old and New Edinburgh, 1880, we're told a wee bit about Dr. James Young Simpson. We're told in number 52, Queen Street, lived and died one of the most illustrious citizens of Edinburgh, Professor Sir James Young Simpson, Baronet, who came to Edinburgh a poor and nearly friendless student, yet in time attained, as Professor of Midwifery in the University, and as the discoverer of extended uses of chloroform, a colossal fame, not only in Europe, but wherever the English language is spoken. He obtained the chair of midwifery in 1840, and 7 years after made his great discovery. In 1849 he was elected president of the Edinburgh College of Physicians, in 1852 president of the Medico Chirurgical Society, and in the following year, under circumstances of the greatest éclat, foreign associate of the French Academy of Medicine. In 1856 the French Academy of Sciences awarded him the Montheian prize of 2,000 francs for the benefits he conferred on humanity by the introduction of anaesthesia by chloroform into the practice of surgery and midwifery. And obviously we know it was Dr. Alexander Fleming, another Scot, who just about the same time discovered antibiotics, which was necessary to beat these wee pestilences that kept coming through. Still necessary today, overused today to the max, certainly. There had been moral outrage over the use of chloroform. Moral outrage, can you imagine? The more godly inclined folk believed that pain was God's leveler, that you had to go through pain in order to be more deserving of God's attention, God's favour, that was how you got into heaven, that by denying yourself pain or escaping pain in some way was to be condemning yourself to hell thereafter. You weren't going to get into heaven if you didn't suffer life's consequences fully. The escape of pain was seen to be especially heinous by those who escaped the pain of childbirth, because the men in charge felt like as childbirth was Eve's curse and a pain that women must bear in order to achieve some form of redemption and make it into a better afterlife for themselves. But we're also told, with chloroform, in Punch's magazine for 1857, that chloroform could be used for seasickness. I don't know how the godly felt about that. Was escaping seasickness going to send them to hell, do we think? So this article is entitled A Freshwater Navy, and always take Punch articles with a grain of salt. They were very cynical, very sarcastic. They were against the non-male faction of society, the non-Christians, the non-white, I believe non-Tories, really non-English, to be fair. Yeah, and they weren't shy about taking the mick out of everyone, not them. This article, however, tells us the Prussian government has issued a proclamation in which it humanely recommends all sailors employed in the Prussian Navy to take, before going to sea, 5 or 6 drops of chloroform in a wine glass full of barley water, as it is considered an admirable preventative against the horrors of seasickness. Kittens. I'm not entirely sure what 5 or 6 drops of chloroform might do to a person. If the mere gas emitted from it can knock you out, what does ingesting the actual liquid do? I mean, were the Prussian Navy just comatose on their ships, and that's how they escaped the seasickness? Again, these articles are often not to be taken as seriously as your regular newspaper articles. During the plague, especially the one of 1645, the affected, when discovered, were transported out with the city into quarantine camps. Those in Glasgow were sometimes just sent out the city and good luck to you. I'm not sure what the quarantine consisted of in terms of Edinburgh. Their belongings were burnt by the plague cleaners, in Edinburgh, they were known as foul clangers, and these foul clangers would walk the streets, ringing their bell and shouting, "Bring out your dead." Plague pits were dug to accommodate the huge influx of the deceased. A lot of these would seem to be under Edinburgh's greenest places. So you have the Queen Street Private Gardens, you've got the Bruntsfield Links, and over by the Leith Links, under the community garden by the primary school there. And I guess there's not a risk, if digging these up, that you're going to inspire a new outbreak of the plague. But these places should probably be left alone and not delved into to find out whether there really are plague pits under there. Maybe they can do something with LiDAR or something instead, just to check out the area, scope them out. There were suggestions by the plague doctors, they're men with the beaks, that the foul clangers would take a belonging, or maybe a couple of the belongings of a plague victim, and insert it into maybe the home of someone that was rather well-to-do, someone that had maybe a bit of money behind them, and in this way the rich person would end up with the plague. Foul clangers would be called in to deal with the belongings in the deceased, and perhaps they might pilfer some of the belongings for themselves, having accomplished that task. There's no real evidence that this happened, however. There's no real evidence to suggest that anybody was spreading the plague on purpose to anyone else. Now, John Porteous was one of the very first plague doctors in Edinburgh, and he died of the plague. He wasn't a very good plague doctor. He didn't know how to avoid the plague. But then we're talking prior to a knowledge of germs and viruses and how these can spread in the blood, bodily fluids, or in the air. So they were a wee bit away from those discoveries. Those who came after, however, were better prepared because lessons had been learned throughout Europe. So you had George Ray, who was a rather famous, accomplished plague doctor. He seems to have done his job rather well. And what he did was go to the city council and say, "I'm prepared to deal with this problem for yous, but I want £100 a month for the privilege of sorting this mess out and helping the citizens and get the city back up and running again." This was considered a king's ransom, and it was agreed to by the city council that they would pay him that sum. They weren't prepared to pay him at all up front. They were going to pay him in a lump sum after the plague was out the city. So the moment they knew, "You've done your job really well. Not only did you not get plague, but here, the city's free from it, here's your compensation for your efforts." The plague ended. George had done his job well, and he had learned the most up-to-date ways of avoiding contracting this himself in order to be able to deal with the plague-stricken victims. So he would wear waxed leather outfit, clothing, covered by a wax leather cloak, and there would be a face mask that was covered with another wax leather hood. The face mask was shaped like a raven's head, and apparently this was due to the thoughts of ravens being almost sacred birds, a kind of offshoot of Celtic and Norse mythology. They would fill the beak of this face mask with sweet smelling herbs and oils, incense, etc. This was because they firmly believed that, not germs, they didn't know of those, miasma was the reason for the cause and spreading of infections and disease. So miasma was just bad smells. Bad smells were how disease travelled. They were convinced of this. So if you were able to lessen the bad smells that you were exposed to, say by putting a posy right under your nose and held there by a mask, that was how you were going to escape the plague. Nothing to do with all these layers of waxed leather and the hood and being completely covered and not being able to breathe in the toxins or be bitten by the fleas in the houses that you go to. No, it was stopping the miasma from getting into your nostrils. So there was a rather interesting mix that was noted inside one of these beaks, an interesting recipe that contained honey, cinnamon, garlic, snake venom and opium. I mean, if it worked for them, then who are we to judge, you know? So George did survive the plague. Like I said, the city was freed from it, and the city council refused to pay him. Not a penny, refused to pay him. And he appealed for 16 years to obtain some kind of recompense, and they did agree, finally, to pay him in instalments. He got one instalment, and then just randomly died of tuberculosis, which the city council weren't very sad about. They had spent the last 16 years claiming bankruptcy in a bid to avoid paying him, and they felt like they escaped rather nicely with only just the one payment having been made. Did he die of tuberculosis? Was he offed? I don't know. These plague doctors may not have known very much about the reason for disease, the cause for the spreads, etc. But from the late 18th, early 19th century, Edinburgh's medical school was world-renowned. They had no bodies, however, to operate on. People were being executed less often, especially into the 19th century. Now, only the condemned could donate their bodies. Well, I don't know that they had a choice in the matter. They didn't go, oh, just before you hang me, hand me over to that surgeon over there after the fact, you know, like, I think it was just a given that if you were executed, your body was going into medical research, whether you wanted it to or not. Now, resurrectionists and grave robbers became almost an intrinsic part of the medical school system, because to be able to learn about the human body, you need human bodies that you're able to open up and have a good look about, you know. They were especially fond of getting people with interesting diseases and varying malformations of the body and physical disabilities, because they wanted to be able to explore these afflictions of the human state. So not only did the universities and the surgeons really appreciate the resurrectionists' work, the grave robbers' work, they paid well for it. So the resurrectionists also rather enjoyed their work. You know, they got paid very well for it, considering the wages of the time. The most famous of these resurrectionists, especially as far as Edinburgh is concerned, is Burke and Hare. They're known worldwide these days. They're often associated with the horrors of the Resurrectionists' work, but they weren't in themselves resurrectionists. They weren't grave robbers. They just killed people and gave these nice, fresh bodies over to surgeons to receive a wee bit of a higher pay, because if you were handing over decomposed bodies, you weren't going to make very much from that. So you wanted nice fresh ones, and what's fresher than a freshly murdered, freshly dead person? So we'll talk a wee bit about the Resurrectionists. This is an article from Robert Chambers' Book of Days, 1885. The Resurrectionists. For nearly 30 years from 1800 had this nefarious traffic flourished, when a select committee of the House of Commons was appointed to investigate the matter. In reply to the following question, does the state of the law actually prevent the teachers of anatomy from obtaining the body of any person, which, in consequence of some peculiarity of structure, they may be particularly desirous of procuring? Sir Astley Cooper stated, "The law does not prevent our obtaining the body of an individual if we think proper, for there is no person, let his situation in life be what it may, whom, if I were disposed to dissect, I could not obtain." In reply to another question, Sir Astley Cooper said, "The law only enhances the price, and does not prevent the exhumation. Nobody is secured by the law. It only adds to the price of the subject." It kind of goes along with where a law can be broken and you can escape on the basis of paying a fine. Really, it's not a law. It's just a crime that you need to pay to do. And for the wealthy, that's not a problem. And these surgeons often came from rather wealthy families because they were educated. Now, the profession had for many years been anxious to devise some plan to prevent the exhumation of bodies, but it was thought too hazardous to attempt the enactment of laws on the subject, in consequence of the necessary publicity of the discussions upon them. The horrible murders committed at Edinburgh under the system of Burking and exposed in the year 1828 at last rendered it peremptorily necessary for the government to establish some means of legalising dissection under restrictions regulated by the ministers of the Crown. An inspector was appointed, to whom the certificate of the death of the individual and the circumstances under which he died were to be submitted before the body could be dissected, and then only in the schools in which anatomising was licensed by the government. And this new system has much raised the characters of those who are teaching anatomy, as well as the science itself, in the estimation of the public. Because, of course, these surgeons are known to be buying dubiously obtained bodies, so they're not going to be very well thought of members of society at this point. The Resurrectionists mostly came to bad ends. There were but few regulars, the others being composed of Spitalfields weavers or thieves who found the disguise of this occupation convenient for carrying on their own peculiar avocations. One was tried and received sentence of death for robbing the Edinburgh mail, but was pardoned upon the intercession of the Archdukes John and Louis, who were much interested by finding the criminal at work in his cell, articulating the bones of a horse. He left the country and was never after heard of. Another resurrectionist, after a long and active career, withdrew from it in 1817 and occupied himself principally in obtaining and disposing of teeth. As a licensed sutler in the peninsula and France, he had drawn the teeth of those who had fallen in battle and had plundered the slain with the produce of these adventures. He built a large hotel at Margate, but his previous occupation being disclosed, the house was avoided and disposed of at a very heavy loss. He was subsequently tried and imprisoned for obtaining money under false pretences, and was ultimately found dead in a public house near Tower Hill. It is credibly reported of one body snatcher that at his death he left nearly £6,000 to his family. One being captured was tried and found guilty of stealing the clothes in which the bodies were buried, and was transported for 7 years. A man, who was long superintendent to the dissecting room at St. Thomas's Hospital, was dismissed for receiving and paying for bodies sent to his employer, and reselling them at an advanced price in Edinburgh. He then turned resurrectionist, was detected and imprisoned, and died in a state of raving madness. I'm not sure how the extraction of teeth from deceased landed that man in such notoriety. Back in the day, after battles, you would find people on the battlefield scavenging from the fallen any objects of worth. Now, in a time where dentistry was mainly done by barbers, because dentistry really just consisted of extracting bothersome teeth, there were people without teeth, and they needed teeth to be able to eat. And dentures, back in the day, were made from actual teeth. And to make those, you needed to obtain the teeth of dead people in order to make a full set of gnashers. So that was so common that I'm not entirely sure why that one man was demonized specifically for the selling of teeth. He was apparently very good at it, having made enough money to buy himself a whole hotel. We'll read a wee bit about Burke and Hare from Grant's Old and New Edinburgh. Again, this is chapter 29. Again, they were not resurrectionists. They were murderers. The bodies just happened to have the same end as the resurrectionists. They ended up with the surgeons. So, in Tanner's Close, a narrow and filthy alley on the north side of the West Port, and in its most unsavoury quarter, was the abode or den of those terrible Irish thugs, William Burke and William Hare, whose murders roughly stated to average between 16 and 30, for the number was never precisely known. In 1827, startled all Europe. Crimes on which a vivid light was first thrown by the powerful articles in the Caledonian Mercury for that year, from the pen of James Brown. The Caledonian Mercury is one of my favourite publications. I go to it for a lot of information. Burke was born in the parish of Orrery in the county of Cork in 1792. His countryman, William Hare, was a native of Londonderry. Both were vagabonds from their birth, and both came to Scotland as labourers, and the former, abandoning his wife and family in Ireland, associated himself with an infamous woman named MacDougall, with whom he became acquainted when working on the Union Canal at Mediston. Hare was also a labourer on the same canal, and used to work at the loading and unloading of boats at Port Hopetoun. Here he became acquainted with a man named Log, whose widow he afterwards married, or with whom he lived at all events. After the canal work was ended, he became a travelling huckster with an old horse and cart, selling fish or crockery, or bartering them for old clothes, old iron, etc. He quarrelled with Log, who expelled him from the low Irish lodging-house he occupied in Tanner's Close, but when Log was dead and buried, he returned to the Close, where he assumed all the rights of a landlord over the 7 bedrooms of the so-called lodging-house, as well as the privileges of a husband, though Mrs. Log was never called by his name. Always addicted to intoxication, the miserable drawings of 2p or 3p nightly from the wretched and obscure Irish tramps, who sought quarters at Log's lodgings, made him more drunken and dissolute than ever. Though no pugilist, he was always ready to fight, and Mrs. Log, also a drunkard, was ready to encounter him at any time. Thus rows, quarrels, oaths, and noises of all kinds perpetually prevailed in Tanner's Close, and such was the life led by this couple when Burke and MacDougall, two congenial spirits, came to live with them, the former calling himself a shoemaker. The place, which went by the name of Log's lodging house, was situated near the foot of Tanner's Close. The entry from the Westport Street to the alley begins with a descent of a few steps, and is dark from the superincumbent mass of building. On proceeding downwards you came, for the house as an accursed place has been razed to the ground, to a small self-contained dwelling of 1 flat containing 3 apartments and ticketed beds to let, an invitation to the passing vagrants, so many of whom were destined never to leave those fatal beds alive. The outer apartment was large, occupied all round by those structures called beds, composed of knocked-up fir stumps and covered with a few grey sheets and brown blankets, among which the squalid wanderer sought rest, and the profligate snored out his debauch under the weight of a nightmare. There was a small closet, the window of which overlooked a dead wall and pigsty, into which were introduced all those who were doomed to death. The character of the house, the incessant rows and shindies, real or pretended, always proceeding there, caused no surprise or alarm when actual cries of murder and suffering rang out upon the night, while the extraordinary mode in which the assassins extinguished life enabled them to pursue their terrible traffic for the dissecting rooms without exciting suspicion. Neither Burke nor Hare was a resurrectionist, but their cupidity was first excited and their diabolical trade suggested by the sum paid to them by a distinguished anatomist for the body of a poor old pensioner named Donald, who died in their hands a short time before his pension became due. Hare, who expected to be reimbursed for £4 owing to him by Donald, was exasperated by the loss, and filling the coffin with bark from the adjacent tannery, it was buried, while the corpse in a sack was carried alternately by Burke and Hare through College Street to Surgeon Square, and sold for £7 10 to Dr. Knox and his assistants. The money, so easily won, seemed to exert a magnetic influence over the terrible quaternion in Tanner's Close. The woman foresaw that other lodgers might die, and hoped to flaunt in finery before the poor denizens of the Portsborough, and the steady and studied career of assassination began, and was continued, by Burke's own confession, from Christmas 1827 to the end of October 1828. That's from the Weekly Journal dated January 6, 1829. The modus operandi was very simple. The unknown and obscure wayfarer was lured into the lodging-house, weary and hungry perhaps, then generally well dosed with coarse raw whisky, preparatory to strangulation, glass after glass being readily and cordially filled in contemplation of the value of the future corpse, as in the case of one unfortunate creature named Mary Haldane. Then all is ready, the drooping head, the closing eye, the languid, helpless body. The women get the hint. They know the unseemliness of being spectators. Nay, they were delicate. A repetition of a former scene, only with even less resistance. Hare holds again the lips, and Burke presses his 12-stone weight on the chest. Scarcely a sigh, but on a trial if dead, a long gurgling indraught. More is not required, and all is still in that dark room, with the window looking out on the dead wall. By 12 the same night, the body of Mary Haldane was in the hands of the skilled anatomist, who made no inquiries, and as the supply from Logg's lodgings increased, the value for each subject seemed to increase also, as the partners began to get from £12 to £14 for each, nearly double what they had received for the body of the poor Highland pensioner. When it's talking about Hare holds again the lips, Burke presses 12-stone weight on the victim's chest. We were shown this in the Edinburgh Dungeons, and it was basically a thumb under the chin and 2 fingers gripping the nose. And that way you cut off the air, and with the pressure on the chest, you had no hope of escaping them, really, before you were suffocated. The attempt to rehearse in detail all the crimes of which these people were guilty would only weary and revolt the reader. Suffice it to say that the discovery of the dead body of a woman, quite nude, with her face covered with blood, among some straw in an occupied house of Burke and another Irishman named Brogan, caused the arrest of the 4 suspects. Hare turned king's evidence, and on the 24th of December 1828, amid such excitement as Edinburgh had not witnessed for ages, William Burke and Helen MacDougall were arraigned at the bar of the Justiciary Court, charged with a succession of murders. Among these were the murder of a very handsome girl named Mary Patterson in the house of Burke's brother, Constantine Burke, a scavenger residing in Gibbs Close, Canongate, that of a well-known idiot named James Wilson, Daft Jamie, at the house in Tanner's Close, of Mary McGonigal or Docherty at the same place. These were selected for proof as sufficient in the indictment, but the real list was never known or exhausted. Among the cases was supposed to be that of a little Italian boy named Ludovico, who went about the city with white mice. 2 little white mice were seen for long after haunting the dark recesses of Tanner's Close, and in Hare's house a cage with the mice's turning wheel was actually found. Of this murder, Burke was supposed to be guiltless, and that it had been a piece of private business done by Hare on his own account. The libel contained a list of great number of articles of dress, etc., worn or used by the various victims, and among other things were Daft Jamie's brass snuff-box and spoon, objects which excited much interest, as Jamie was a favourite with the citizens, and his body must have been recognised by Dr. Knox the instant he saw it on the dissecting table. The presiding judge of the court was the Lord Justice Clerk Boyle. The others were the Lords Pitmilly, Meadowbank, Mackenzie. The prosecutor was Sir William Ray, Lord Advocate. The counsel for Burke was the Dean of Faculty, that for MacDougall, the celebrated Henry Cockburn. The witnesses were 55 in number, the two principal being Hare and the woman Log, received as evidence in the characters of Socii Criminis. Now, turning King's evidence meant that he was testifying against his partner in crime in order to avoid the death sentence. When all had been examined and the cases were brought fatally home to Burke, while his paramour escaped with a verdict of not proven, a loud whisper ran through the court of, "Where are the doctors?" As it was known, the names of Knox and others were placed on the back of the indictment as witnesses, yet they could scarcely have appeared but at the risk of their lives, so high was the tide of popular indignation against them. Burke was sentenced to death in the usual form, the Lord Justice Clerk expressing regret that his body could not be gibbeted in chains, but was to be publicly dissected, adding, "And I trust that if it is ever customary to preserve skeletons, yours will be preserved, in order that posterity may keep in remembrance your atrocious crimes." So the body of Burke was sent appropriately where he had sent so many others, and his skeleton now hangs in the museum of the university. The Parliament Square rang with reiterated cheers as if the city held jubilee when the sentence was pronounced. But the people were greatly dissatisfied with the verdict of not proven in the case of MacDougall, and had Hare not effected his escape secretly by the mail home to Ireland, the people would infallibly have torn him limb from limb. In prison and with death before him, Burke's thoughts were ever recurring to earth. Once he was observed, says Alexander Leighton, to be silent and meditative, and a pious attendant took it as a sign of contrition, but Burke said suddenly, "I think I'm entitled and ought to get that £5 from Dr. Knox, which is still unpaid, on the body of the woman Docherty." "Why," replied the astonished pietist, "Dr. Knox lost it by the transaction as the body was taken from him." "That was not my business," said Burke. "I delivered the subject, and he ought to have kept it." He confessed in the lock-up house that he had participated in many more murders than those he had been indicted for, and said that after his mind was composed, he would make disclosures, which would implicate several others besides Hare and his wife in the same crimes for which he was doomed to die. He was asked, how did he feel when pursuing his horrible avocation? He replied that in his waking moments he had no feeling, but that when he slept he had frightful dreams, which previously he had been unaccustomed to. "The fact is," continues the editor of the Weekly Journal, "that the wretch, when awake, by means of ardent spirits steeped his senses in forgetfulness. At night he had short fits of sleep during which he raved, but his expressions were inarticulate, and he ground his teeth in the most fearful manner. In the morning he was removed to the Calton jail and secured by a chain to the massive iron god. On the 27th January he was unchained and conveyed to the lock-up in Liberton's Wynd, at the heap of which the gallows was erected. He was attended by 2 Catholic priests and 2 Presbyterian ministers, for his ideas of a religion were somewhat vague and cloudy. When his heavy fetters were removed and they fell with a clank on the floor, "So may all earthly chains fall from me," he exclaimed, but went to die evidently with the hopeless secret feeling that he was too deeply sunk in crime even to think of the infinite mercy of heaven. Yet was he eager to be dead, and ascended the scaffold with his eyes half closed, as if anxious to be beyond the roar of the vast assemblage that thronged the great thoroughfare, far as eye could reach, and filled every window, roof, and foot of vantage ground. The deep hoarse roar of voices rose into a terrible and prolonged yell, on which he threw around him a fierce glance of desperate defiance and hatred, and again rose a prolonged yell of disgust and half-glutted vengeance, when, after hanging the usual time, the body was conveyed to the college. The sight of the execution, instead of allaying the passions of the justly excited people, inflamed them with a desire to drag his body out and tear it to pieces. But a grand public exhibition was arranged for the morrow, and the white, naked corpse, so loathed, was laid on the black marble table of the theatre and displayed to thousands who streamed through the entire day. Burke was cut up and put in strong pickle and in small barrels for the dissecting table, and part of his skin was tanned. The woman MacDougall, after the execution, had the daring effrontery to present herself in Tanner's Close again, but the people of the Portsborough rose, and she only found in the watch-house a narrow escape from an infuriated mob, according to the Weekly Journal. In the den of murder occupied by Burke, continues the paper, several objects strengthened the general persuasion that many other wretches had fallen a sacrifice under the same roof. The bloody straw in the corner, a heap of bloody clothes on the floor, and a pile of old boots and shoes, chiefly those of females, amounting to several dozens, for which the pretended trade of a shoemaker can never account, furnish ample food for suspicion. The idea suggests itself that the clothes and shoes belonged to the unfortunate girls whom this monster decoyed to his house, intoxicated and murdered, as he did the poor old wanderer. The two houses which were inhabited by this gang were well chosen for the purpose to which they were put. Burke's dwelling, in which he has only resided since June last, is at the end of a long passage and separated from every other house except one. After going through the close from the street, there is a descent by a stair to the passage, at the end of which is to be found this habitation of wickedness. It consists of one apartment, an oblong square at the end of which is a miserable bed, under which may still be seen some straw in which his murdered victims were concealed. The house of Hare is in a more retired situation. The passage to it is by a dark and dirty close in which there are no inhabitants, except in the flat above. Both houses are on the ground floor. Tanner's Close still exists, at least it did in 1880, but the abodes of those two wretches, the most cold-blooded criminals in history, are now numbered, as we have stated, among the things that were. Another famous miscreant of Edinburgh was Major Weir and his sister Janet. Major Weir was a Covenanter, and he enjoyed torturing those of a Catholic persuasion. At the time he was doing this, it was allowed and didn't make him a bad person. He was well respected and lived with his sister, where there's a Quaker meeting house now. When he turned 71, he started confessing to varying crimes, including incest, bestiality, and people didn't believe him until his sister kind of went out and went, yeah, he did those things, and I joined him, and yeah, we were monsters together, basically. Now, Janet stripped naked prior to her execution, basically told the people that she was one of the devil's own, and went to her death seemingly fully believing that she was heading down to join Satan. And when Weir's neck was encircled by the fatal rope at the place of execution, he was bid to say, "Lord, be merciful to me." But he only replied fiercely and mournfully, "Let me alone. I will not. I have lived as a beast, and must die like a beast." I don't feel like I need to get into the history of Major Weir and his sister to any great extent. We did a full covering of his antics for both the Witches episode for Independence Live and the Paranormal Randomness in Scottish History last Halloween. We were told about a couple who haven't made it into the history books that I have as yet. Now, this was Christina and Francis Allen. Now, they moved to Edinburgh in 1883 from Fife. Francis was abusive. They lived at 8 Royal Exchange. He was charged with assaulting Christina and received 20 days of imprisonment for the crime. 20 days for assaulting his wife. He was later charged with driving his horse and cart drunk. Now, he was a cab driver. He had picked up a passenger, and en route to the passenger's destination, he had stopped twice at bars in order to get a drink, and the passenger quite rightly complained about him. He was charged 30 days of imprisonment for driving drunk with a cart. 30 days driving drunk with a cart, 20 days assaulting your wife. Christina and Francis ended up separated, and it was actually Francis that ended up taking the children and just absconding with them, leaving Christina behind. Now, she wasn't able to pay rent without him, and she didn't know where her children had been taken. On the 17th of May, 1884, she jumped to her death out of the window of her apartment, just by Mary King's Close. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Apparently the sound of her landing, the bang of that, could be heard for some distance across Edinburgh. The populace also stated to those inquiring about her death that she had actually been seen wandering through Edinburgh in just a real distressed state for a few days prior to making that decision for herself. So, yeah, that was a sad wee story, but it's about some of the real people that lived in and around Mary King's Close. So I like that we were told about Christina Allen, because that's a shame for her. And I wonder what happened to her children. I wonder if they ever wondered about their mum or went looking for her later on in life. Did their father tell them? Did he even know that she'd taken her own life? I can't answer these things. I don't know. Now, another of Edinburgh's most hated was a man named Deacon William Brodie. Now, he was a well-respected cabinet maker. He was a joiner, locksmith, etc. He did live a double life, though. He was, like I say, well-respected by day, but at night he was a debauched, drunken mess. He racked up huge gambling debts, which he paid off. He had several illegitimate children, which he supported, but it was the ways in which he obtained the ability to pay off these debts and support his extra family. So he would make wax copies of his clients' keys, and then he would recreate the keys, and he would go and let himself into the premises and just rob them. So they did catch him when he was trying to rob the custom house, which would have been a large score for him, the custom house. A night watchman had actually left keys behind and had returned to get them when he ran into a robbery in action, and he recognised Deacon Brodie. I mean, he was a well-known guy, and Brodie escaped to Amsterdam. He was caught and he was executed at the gallows for his crimes. Now, Brodie didn't seem to care very much about the fact that he had been caught and he was going to be executed. In chapter 12 of Grant's Old New Edinburgh, we're told that Brodie was cool, determined, and indifferent. His self-possession never forsook him, and he spoke of his approaching end with levity as a leap in the dark, and he only betrayed emotion when he was visited for the last time by his daughter Cecile, a pretty child of 10 years of age. He came on the scaffold in a full suit of black, with his hair dressed and powdered. Smith was attired in white linen, trimmed with black, Having put on white nightcaps, says a print of the time, Brodie pointed to Smith to ascend the steps that led to the drop, and in an easy manner, clapping him on the shoulder, said, "George Smith, you are first in hand." Upon this, Smith, whose behaviour was highly penitent and resigned, slowly ascended the steps, followed by Brodie, who mounted with briskness and agility, and examined the dreadful apparatus with attention, particularly the halter destined for himself. And well might he do so with terrible interest, as he was to be the first to know the excellence of an improvement he had formerly made on that identical gibbet, the substitution of what is called the drop for the ancient practice of the double ladder. The ropes proving too short, Brodie stepped down to the platform and entered into easy conversation with his friends. This occurred no less than 3 times, while the great bell of St. Giles was tolling slowly, and the crowd of spectators was vast. Brodie died without either confessing or denying his guilt, but the conduct and bearing of Smith were very different. In consequence of the firmness and levity of the former, a curious story became quickly current, to the effect that in the Tolbooth he had been visited by Dr. Pierre de Graver, a French quack who undertook to restore him to life after he had hung the usual time, and that on the day before the execution he had marked the arms and temples of Brodie to indicate where he would apply the lancet. Moreover, it was said that having to lengthen the rope thrice proved that they had bargained secretly with the executioner for a short fall. When cut down, the body was instantly given to 2 of his own workmen, who placed it on a cart and drove it at a furious rate round the back of the castle, with the idea that the rough jolting might produce resuscitation. It was then taken to one of his workshops in the Lawn Market, where de Graver was in attendance, but all attempts at bleeding failed. The deacon was gone, and nothing remained but to lay him where he now lies, in the north-east corner of the Chapel of Ease burying ground. His dark lantern and sets of false keys, presented by the Clerk of Justiciary to the Society of Antiquaries, are still preserved in the city. The last event that we were told about on Mary King's Close tour was that of the Porteous mob, the Porteous riots. Now, Captain John Porteous was head of the city guard, and he oversaw hangings. The hanging of smugglers, however, was an issue and riled the city's populace. Now, some in attendance at the executions were shot under his purview, and he was taken to the Tolbooth, and this Tolbooth is gone now. It's marked by a heart on the paving slab called the Heart of Midlothian that people still spit on due to the Tolbooth being such a hated place back in the day. Now, he was sentenced to be executed, but he was reprieved by royal assent down in England. And this was because he was a king's man. And I think they felt like any decision he had taken to quell the dissatisfaction of the populace at the hanging of mere smugglers was probably right for him to do. But before he was released from the Tolbooth, intimation of his impending release spread like wildfire through Edinburgh, and the people were not happy. They felt like justice could actually be got for this man. You know, they might see justice in him being hanged, and they couldn't understand why he was being let out when he was responsible for the shooting and deaths of what were seen to be innocent people. So, the tavern's empty that night. Porteous hasn't been released yet. He's to be released the next morning. And the people have now got something of a drink in them. And they've been talking about this all day. They can't let it lie. People are not happy. So they decide that they're going to take matters into their own hands. And they broke him out of the Tolbooth. They just sidelined the guards, got them out the way, and there were so many of them compared to the inhabitants of the toll booth that they were easily able to overcome any hurdles in their way to obtaining their object, Captain Porteous. And these people consider themselves good people. They were doing this with justice as their end goal, you know? So they broke into a shop and they obtained the rope, the length of rope with which to hang him. But they paid. They left money behind for any damage and the rope. They paid their way. They didn't want to be seen as thieves or ne'er-do-wells. They were merely acting under what they considered to be good justice. And they strung him up from a shop and hung him. And he was found strung up next to a shop window. Nobody was ever brought up on charges for his death. He was buried in Greyfriars Kirk. It was a nice wee rundown. We got at Mary King's Close. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I did interject a couple of times with some additional information, especially when it came to Major Weir. And I love Major Weir's story. But again, I didn't want to add more time to the video elaborating on Major Weir when I've already gone into his story in quite a lot of detail a couple of times previously. So by all means, if you want to catch his story, there are a couple of places that you can do that. But I'll post links to all the sources cited throughout this video. And I'll also post a link to the Edinburgh University's Witchcraft trial map. And maybe some of the videos in which some of this information has already been relayed by myself. Maybe an Indie Live or other videos. So thank you very much for joining me this Halloween. I'm sorry I didn't dress up this year like I did last year. It's been kind of a really hectic week. We were out and about as well, up in Dunfermline. We went to Linlithgow Palace and the Falkirk Kelpies, etc. So I've been really busy and I really wanted to dress up and make it a whole Halloween thing, but I was just finding myself with not very much time at all. So thank you very much for joining me, and I may catch you for the next one. Take care.